Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another Legion class guide. This is an ongoing series where I go over the core gameplay of each class and spec in the Legion Alpha, and sort of give you an idea of how they're played and how their core mechanics work. In this video, we'll be going over the Survival Hunter. Survival is arguably the spec that has changed the most this expansion. It's received quite the makeover because this is no longer a ranged spec. In this expansion, you've cast aside your ranged weapons in favor for the polearm artifact, Talon Strike. You're now in the thick of it in melee range alongside your pet, and you use a wide variety of melee attacks, traps, and other gadgets to take down your enemies. We're still on the focus system, so no big changes there. We passively generate this over time, and we have a handful of abilities that spend it. As usual, let's get our disclaimers out of the way. The Hunter is not my main class on Live. I did a lot of training on both Live and Legion to get a solid understanding of how the survival spec plays and how it's changed for Legion, but keep in mind that this is from a very casual Hunter's perspective. Just something to remember when I talk about a spell or give my opinion on something. And by all means, if you catch any errors, feel free to let me know so I can patch them up with an annotation. Also keep in mind what you're about to see is all alpha gameplay, so things that you like or don't like are always subject to change. A lot of spells have been changed, removed, or added. I'll go over all of them one by one in the spell book, and I'll also show you them all in action so you can get a good idea of how the spec plays to see if you would like it or not. I'll sort of go over these in order of importance, putting a higher priority on the bread and butter abilities that make up the core of the survival spec. And at the end of the video, I'll show you some real fights and narrate them a bit so you can see how all of it comes together. As I'm going through these, keep an eye on the bottom right hand corner of the screen if you want to see the tooltips for the exact numbers and such. Let's start off with our most damaging attack, Mongoose Bite. This ability is a pretty big focus of this spec. We have a few effects that are based around it. This deals a heavy amount of physical damage to your target and grants you a buff called Mongoose Fury. This increases the damage done by Mongoose Bite by 50% for 12 seconds, stacking up to 6 times for a max 300% increase in damage. This makes Mongoose Bite hit like a truck, but it does have its limitations. One is that successive Mongoose Bites don't reset the duration. So once that 12-second timer starts, you want to get in as many Mongoose Bites as possible to try to stack that buff. This has a 10-second cooldown, but it also has 3 charges. We also have some effects that I'll go over later that function as a source of charges, so it's not as straightforward as it seems. Next up we have our Bleed, Lacerate. This applies a bleeding wound to a single target, dealing a heavy amount of physical damage over 12 seconds. It costs 35 focus and it has a 10-second cooldown. So this is something you're going to want to have up all the time. We actually have a surprising amount of damage over time effects. Even more than Affliction Warlocks if you take the right talents, which is kind of interesting, I think. Next up we have Flanking Strike. This is a coordinated attack between you and your pet. This causes both you and your pet to simultaneously deal a heavy amount of physical damage to your target. And if your target is attacking you, your pet's attack will deal 50% increased damage and generate 400% more threat. Otherwise, if your target isn't attacking you, you'll instead deal that 50% more damage. It costs 40 focus and it has a base 6-second cooldown. It also has double the normal chance to trigger Hunting Companion, which is our new mastery. This is one of the ways we're going to get our Mongoose Bite charges like I mentioned earlier. This causes your pet's attacks to have a chance to give you a charge of Mongoose Bite, which is increased as you stack Mastery. With my current stats it's only around 10%, but with how fast your pet attacks it actually procs a lot. I prefer Masteries like this because it can change your rotation. I think it's more interesting than some of the other ones out there that just have a flat increase in damage to certain abilities. Next up we have our AoE, Carve. This is a basic cleave. It costs 40 focus and it deals a light amount of physical damage to your target. There are a couple of talents you can take to improve this, but overall our AoE feels very strong this expansion. And we have our filler spell, Raptor Strike. This costs 25 focus and it deals a light amount of physical damage to a single target. This is what you're going to be using when you have Lacerate up and Flanking Strike and Mongoose Bite are on cooldown. As it stands right now with the way our rotation works, it's actually pretty rare to use this. Next up we'll go over our traps, of which we have 3. Explosive, Freezing, and Tar. First up we have our classic Explosive Trap. When you use this, you toss a fire trap at your feet and any enemy who walks over it causes it to explode, dealing a medium amount of initial fire damage and burning all enemies within 5 yards of the explosion for some additional fire damage over 10 seconds. It has a cooldown of 30 seconds and it'll exist for 1 minute or until you replace it. So this is just a nice source of AoE damage here. Next up we have Tar Trap, which is pretty similar to Frost Trap. This hurls a tar trap to a targeted location, and when it's triggered, it creates a 10-yard radius pool of tar for 30 seconds that slows all enemies within the area by 50%. It has a 40-yard range and a 30-second cooldown. The radius is extremely low compared to our old Frost Trap, so much so that I think it actually might be a placeholder. So as it stands right now, this one has limited usefulness in my opinion. And lastly for our traps, we have Freezing Trap, which is still our crowd control. This throws a trap at a targeted location, and any enemy who springs it is incapacitated for 1 minute, and any damage will of course break the effect. This has a 40-yard range and a 30-second cooldown. Next up we have a very basic ranged attack. It's our only baseline one actually, and that's Hatchet Toss. This has a 5 to 30-yard range, and it deals a very light amount of physical damage to a single target. It's basically just a button for you to press if you can't get in melee range. It doesn't have any procs or anything like that, so for the most part we're just going to be using this for pulling. We do have a tool to get into melee range fast though, and that's Harpoon. Think of this as a reverse death grip. This hurls a harpoon at your target, rooting them in place for 3 seconds and pulling you to them. It has a 5 to 40-yard range and a 20-second cooldown. The root is a real nice bonus. One of our stronger points this expansion is debilitating our enemies, and this is one of the ways we can do that and close in on them at the same time. While we're on the subject, next up we have Wing Clip. This costs 30 focus, and it reduces the movement speed of your target by 50% for 15 seconds. So just a basic slow here. We pretty much needed one now that we're a melee class, so nothing surprising here. And sort of in the same vein, next up we have Muzzle. This is a basic interrupt. This interrupts spell casting, preventing any spell in whatever school of magic you use it on to be locked out for 3 seconds. And it has a 15-second cooldown. And we of course still have Feign Death. A hunter wouldn't be a hunter without this spell. I'm sure you all know how this works. When you use this, you play dead, tricking enemies into ignoring you. It has a 30-second cooldown, and it lasts up to 6 minutes or until you cancel it. Next up, I'll go over our aspects, of which we have 3. These are now just cooldowns as opposed to auras. First up, we have Aspect of the Cheetah, which is our mobility aspect. This increases your movement speed by 90% for 3 seconds, and then 30% for another 9 seconds. It has a 3-minute cooldown, which I think is a little harsh. I'd say between Wing Clip, Harpoon, and our traps we're fine mobility-wise for PvP, but for PvE where some of those tools aren't available, this hurts. I would definitely take a shorter duration for a shorter cooldown. Next we have our DPS cooldown, Aspect of the Eagle. This gives both you and your pet a 10% increase in crit chance to all abilities, and more importantly, it also increases your chance to gain charges of Mongoose Bite by 100%. It has a 2-minute cooldown and a duration of 10 seconds. That Mongoose Bite proc chance is huge, and I think the 2-minute cooldown is very generous for what this ability does. And lastly for our aspects, we have Aspect of the Turtle, which as you would guess is our defensive cooldown. This deflects all attacks and reduces all damage you take by 30% for 8 seconds. It has a 3-minute cooldown, and a downside is that you can't attack while it's active. You can however place traps while it's active, so you're not completely pacified. And we also have our heal, Exhilaration. This instantly heals you for 30% of your max life and your pet for 100% of its max life, and it has a 2-minute cooldown. If I had to pick one weak point of survival this expansion, it would be our self-heals. One of the side effects of our transition from range to melee is that we're more squishy, and we really don't have enough defensive abilities to counteract that. We basically only have this in Aspect of the Turtle. We do have some nice PvP talents, but even with those I think we're going to have a rough time PvP-wise if we get focused. Next up I'll go over our pet, which is obviously a big part of the hunter class. I don't want to go too much into detail for the sake of not making this video an hour long, but your pet still has 3 specs: Ferocity, Tenacity, and Cunning. Ferocity is your damage spec, and it has the exact 4 abilities that it has in Draenor. I'll mouse over these here quickly and you can pause the video if you want to see the exact numbers, but like I said, they're all the same as they are in Draenor, so it's not too interesting. We still have Dash, Heart of the Phoenix, Combat Experience, and Spiked Collar. Every spec also now has the Hunting Companion passive, which is just our mastery. It doesn't show the exact percentage here for some reason, but you can see that in your spellbook anyway, so it's not a big deal. Tenacity is still our tank spec. We still have Charge, Last Stand, Thunderstomp, Blood of the Rhino, Combat Experience, and Great Stamina, which are all exactly the same as they are in Draenor. And for Cunning we have Bullheaded, Dash, Roar of Sacrifice, Boar's Speed, Combat Experience, and Cornered like with the other specs saw no changes. And that's pretty much it for all of the important stuff. Everything else I didn't mention are still functionally the same pretty much, maybe just percentage or cooldown changes. I'll mouse over them here quickly and you can pause the video if you want to see the exact numbers, but abilities I haven't mentioned yet are Eagle Eye, Flare, Beast Lore, Dismiss Pet, Feed Pet, Mend Pet, and Tame Beast. There's not a lot going on passive-wise. We only have 2 including our Mastery, which I already went over. Our other one is Survivalist, which heals us for 15% of our max life over 10 seconds every time we kill an enemy. But that's every ability in passive. If I didn't list anything from Draenor, it was either moved to talents, removed entirely, or they just haven't put it back yet. Next up we'll go over the revamped talents. And just like the abilities and passives, I'll go over every single talent here and show you them in action. I'll also have a link to the talent calculator in the description if you want to see them for yourself. First up, for the level 15 tier, we have Animal Instincts. This causes your flanking strike to grant you and your pet a random buff for 7 seconds. There are 3 different buffs. We have the Instincts of the Raptor, which increases your pet's haste by 10%, Instincts of the Cheetah, which increases your movement speed by 20%, and Mongoose, which increases your mastery by 10%. So this has a random factor, which is pretty interesting. I'm not sure if it's going to be the go-to talent for raiding, because I can see people getting frustrated if they keep getting Cheetah over and over. But we'll just have to wait and see, I guess. Next up, we have a ranged skill, Throwing Axes. This costs 15 focus, and you throw 3 axes at an enemy, each dealing a light amount of physical damage. It has 2 charges and a 15-second recharge. So this just gives you another tool for ranged DPS. There's no minimum range as well, so you can even use it in melee range, and it does some pretty decent damage. Lastly, for the level 15 tier, we have Way of the Machnathal. This causes Raptor Strike to also buff your attack power by 5% for 8 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. The 8-second window is plenty of time to be able to have 100% uptime on this buff. Unlike Mongoose Fury, this refreshes whenever you reapply it, so it's very powerful as it stands right now. The only problem with this is, like I mentioned earlier, with all of our different abilities and procs, getting the opportunity to use Raptor Strike is actually pretty rare. Remember that it's our filler spell. We're only supposed to use it when everything else is on cooldown, but with the way things are now, that's very few and far between. Next up, we have Caltrops, which replaces Tar Trap. This scatters Caltrops in a targeted area for 15 seconds. Enemies who step in them take some damage over time, and they also have their movement speed reduced by 70% for 15 seconds. This is pretty buggy as of this build. It seems the actual trigger area is way smaller than the visual range, and when they do trigger it, the slow wears off as soon as they exit the area, so as it stands right now, it's not too useful. Next up, we have Improved Traps. This reduces the cooldown of Freezing Trap by 15%, and the cooldowns of your Explosive and Tar Traps by 50%. This brings Freezing Trap's cooldown to 25.5 seconds, and Explosive and Tar down to 15. So just a really nice passive. Like I said earlier, Explosive Trap is still something you want to use on single targets, so this is a nice boost to damage. It's also worth noting that this allows you to have 2 tar splotches active at the same time. Once a new trap is popped, it doesn't replace the old one. Lastly, for the level 30 tier, we have Steel Trap, which replaces Freezing Trap. This immobilizes your target for 30 seconds instead of incapacitating them, and it deals a heavy amount of bleeding damage over the duration. Damage other than the bleeding effect will break the immobilize, but the bleed will stay, so you can just use this as another dot if you want. Although it does have a 1-minute cooldown as opposed to Freezing Trap's 30-second cooldown. For the level 45 tier, we have Post Haste. This used to be tied to Disengage, but since we don't have that anymore, this now causes your Harpoon to also free you from movement impairing effects and increase your movement speed by 60% for 8 seconds. So just a nice mobility boost to have considering the long cooldown on Aspect of the Cheetah. Next up, we have Farstrider. This causes your ability critical strikes to have a 10% chance to reduce the remaining cooldown on Harpoon. This one isn't bad either. I think the 10% chance is a little low considering Harpoon's cooldown is only 20 seconds anyways. I think the 20 to 25% range would be more realistic, but it's still not bad. Next up, we have Dash. This increases the duration of Aspect of the Cheetah by 3 seconds. It actually increases the duration of each stage by 3 seconds, so it's 6 seconds total. It's not too bad, but like I said earlier, I think the problem with Cheetah right now is the cooldown, not the duration. I would definitely take, say, a 30 to 50% reduction in cooldown over an increased duration. For the level 60 tier, we have Murder of Crows, which has seen a return. This is pretty much the same. This summons a flock of crows to attack your target for 15 seconds. And if your target dies while it's active, the cooldown is reset. The cooldown itself is 1 minute, and it also costs 30 focus, so just a really good dot to have. But unfortunately it's bugged out right now, and the cooldown doesn't refresh when you kill an enemy like it's supposed to. Next up, we have another dot, and that's the Dragon's Fire Grenade. This is an AoE dot. It says this deals a heavy amount of fire damage over 8 seconds to your target and sets it ablaze, dealing a light amount of damage to all enemies near it every 5.2 seconds. I'm not sure if this is a bug or not, or if they just haven't updated the tooltip, but it doesn't do what it says it does. Through testing I saw that it doesn't do any initial damage at all, and all enemies near the target you used it on get the burning debuff, causing fire damage to all nearby enemies every second for 8 seconds. This means the more enemies you hit with this, the more powerful it is. Each enemy hit is dealing an extra 5,000-ish to itself and every enemy near it. I'm not sure if this is intended or not, but it seems pretty broken. As of this build, it just deals a stupid amount of damage if you hit enough enemies with it, and it's pretty much the go-to talent for AoE. And finally, for the level 60 tier, we have Snake Hunter. This instantly grants you 3 charges of Mongoose Bite, so it gives you some really good burst. Its cooldown is only 1 minute, so just a really solid talent overall. This whole tier seems really good, and it's hard to pick just one. For the level 75 tier we have Sticky Bomb. This hurls a concussive grenade at your target which sticks to them and explodes after a 3-second delay, and everything caught within the explosion gets knocked back. This has a 40-yard range and a 30-second cooldown. As of this alpha build, this one is a pretty big dud. The knockback is incredibly short, like one step backwards short, and the fact that it doesn't do damage makes it pretty worthless aside from interrupting a spell cast or something. Next up we have Ranger's Net, which replaces Wing Clip. This throws a net at your target, rooting them in place for 3 seconds and also reducing their movement speed by 50% for 15 seconds. It has a cost of 30 focus and a 1-second cooldown. This will be incredibly annoying in PvP, I'm sure, because as it stands right now, there's no diminishing returns, and with the rate of your focus generation, you can infinitely root someone, which is pretty hilarious actually. I don't think that's going to make it to live though. They're either going to give it diminishing returns or a longer cooldown, because as it stands right now, this is just wacky. Anyways, lastly for the level 75 tier, we have our classic Camouflage. When you use this, both you and your pet gain stealth, and while it's active, you gain 2% health every second. It has a duration and a cooldown of 1 minute, and if you take damage while it's active, it dissipates. This is a little different than the version on live. It's now straight up stealth, which you used to have to get through a glyph, but you also don't have that 50% reduction in movement speed. One trade-off is that you can no longer use it in combat, but of course you can get past that if you use it after feigned death. And this is probably a bug, but right now you can eat, hearth, and mount while it's active. You can even send your pet into attack and your stealth won't break, but once again I'm not sure if that's intended or not. For the level 90 tier we have Butchery, which replaces Carve. This deals about 3.5 times the damage of Carve. It has the same 40 focus cost, and it's a full-blown AoE as opposed to a cleave. It also has a base 15-second cooldown, but it has 3 charges as well. So it's just another option for AoEing. It does more damage, and it is less restrictive if your enemies aren't bunched up nicely. Next up we have Mortal Wounds. This causes Lacerate to have a 2% chance to give you a charge of Mongoose Bite every time it deals damage. Lacerate, if you recall, is our single target bleed. It ticks 12 times over 12 seconds, so that's an average 24% chance to get a free Mongoose Bite over its full duration. Next up we have a passive, Serpent Sting. This causes any target hit by Raptor Strike or Carve to also take a medium amount of nature damage over 15 seconds. This is a huge boost to AoE, and if you're using this with Explosive Trap, Caltrops, and Dragon's Fire Grenade, your AoE damage is insane. I think out of all of the classes I played so far, Survival Hunter has the best AoE. It's all damage over time too, so you can just apply everything and kite if you need to. It's really fun to do, and I think it's one of the highlights of the spec so far. Finally, for the level 100 tier we have Spitting Cobra. This is our only way we can generate focus aside from the passive regeneration. This summons a Spitting Cobra that deals a light amount of damage every 2 seconds, and while it's active, you get 3 extra focus per second. It has a cooldown of 1 minute and a duration of 30 seconds, so that's 90 focus in total. Honestly, I think focus isn't as important as it used to be. I mean, it'll obviously vary depending on your talent choice, but for the most part, with the current focus cost and cooldown of everything, you're never really starving for focus. At least for single target anyways. AoE is another story because Carve doesn't have a cooldown. For single target, the only thing that this will really let you do is get a few more Raptor Strikes out, which isn't anything too crazy. Next up we have a big buff to our trap, and that's the Expert Trapper passive. This improves all of your traps in various ways. When Freezing Trap ends, its victim and all enemies close to it will have their movement speed slowed by 50% for 4 seconds. Explosive Trap's dot damage is increased by 100%. Tar Trap has a chance to root enemies that pass through it for 4 seconds. And your Steel Trap, if you took it, deals a medium amount of damage immediately when it's triggered. So not a bad talent overall, and it combos nicely with improved traps if you took that. And finally we have Aspect of the Beast. This causes your Flanking Strike to also have a bonus effect depending on what spec your pet is. If it's Ferocity spec, your target also takes a light amount of damage over 6 seconds. If it's Tenacity, your pet takes 15% reduced damage for 6 seconds. And if it's Cunning, your target's movement speed is reduced by 50% for 4 seconds. Flanking Strike, if you recall, has a base 6-second cooldown, so you'll be able to get these effects fairly often, which is nice. And that's it for all of the talents, as of this build anyways. Next up, I'll talk about the artifact for the Survival Hunter, and that's the Polearm Talon Claw. This artifact comes with an ability called Fury of the Eagle. This is similar to the Monk's Fist of Fury spell. When you use this, you unleash a furious barrage of attacks to all enemies in front of you over 4 seconds. And its damage is increased through the Mongoose Strike buff, Mongoose Fury. So you're going to want to save this until you have full stacks of Mongoose Fury in order to maximize its damage. It has a 45-second cooldown, which isn't too bad. Your target can easily move out of it, but with all of the slows and roots we have, you can set it up in such a way that they'll take a big chunk of its total damage before they can get away. One thing that this doesn't mention is that it also adds 4 seconds to your Mongoose Fury buff, so that'll never run out while you're channeling it, which is really nice. It seems like a lot of these tooltips are in need of updates because they leave out some really important stuff. Speaking of which, another hidden effect is that when you drop to 30% life, an eagle will swoop down and assist you, stunning the target for 5 seconds and dealing some extra damage. And it has a 4-minute cooldown. There are also some interesting passives you can unlock. You can find calculators for this all over the place. I'll have a link in the description, but I'll go over the more major ones here. First up, we have Aspect of the Skylord. This buffs your Aspect of the Eagle, causing it to also increase all damage you deal by 30% for its duration. Combining that with the full 6 stacks of Mongoose Fury and Talon Strike results in some really good damage. Next up, we have Talon Strike. This causes your basic attacks, in other words your auto attacks, to have a chance to trigger 2 additional blows. This is pretty neat. Think of it as a Wind Fury for hunters. Unfortunately, it's not fully implemented yet, so I can't show you it in action. Next up, we have Eagle's Bite. This causes Harpoon to apply a dot that deals some damage over 12 seconds and is refreshed by auto attacks. Like I said, we have a crazy amount of dots. With Lacerate, Explosive Trap, Steel Trap, Murder of Crows, and Serpent Sting, that's a total of 6 dots you could have on a single target, which is insane. The rest of these are pretty generic, some interesting stuff, but mainly just percentage increases to abilities and whatnot. I'll mouse over these here quickly and you can pause the video if you want to read them, and like I said, I'll have a link to that calculator in the description if you want to check them out. You don't have to choose between any of these traits, you'll be able to get them all eventually. You just need to get enough artifact power, which you'll get by questing, PvPing, raiding, and so on. And that's it for all of the abilities, talents, and artifact traits, at least for this alpha build anyways. I'm sure they'll add more or change some stuff later on, but that's okay because the purpose of this video is just to give you a basic idea of how the spec is played, and that's something that's very unlikely to change as they update the game. Now let's put all of this together. The only way to get an idea of how the spec is played is to see it in action, so as always I'll show you some basic fights here and narrate them a bit. Let's start off with our single target fights. Like I mentioned earlier, I really like using all of these dots, so for talents I have Steel Trap, Murder of Crows, Serpent Sting, and Expert Trapper to help out with that. The rotation is probably the hardest out of any class I've played so far. It's kind of hard because you never have that downtime where you're just waiting on a skill to come off cooldown. It seems like you always have something to use, so admittedly my rotation is a mess here as you'll see. But in general the first thing I do is try to get all of my dots up. I hit them with the Raptor Strike for that Serpent Sting, I lacerate them for the Bleed, Murder of Crows, Explosive Trap, and every minute I use Steel Trap. Once I have everything up, I start with the Mongoose Bite spam, making sure to use it as many times as I get those procs. And I try to save the artifact ability Fury of the Eagle for 6 stacks. Like I said, it's pretty rare to have that downtime where you're just spamming Raptor Strike. Even getting out Flanking Strike can be rare if you're proccing Mongoose Bite a lot because obviously that takes precedence. I will say that Mongoose Bite hits incredibly hard if you have 6 stacks going. Survival is definitely up there in the top specs for single target damage. At least for level 100 that is. And I'm sure it could be even better if I practiced the rotation more because as you can see here it's a free-for-all. I'm sure it could be simplified as well if I picked more passives rather than abilities, but like I said I like throwing all of those dots on. Here you can see I'm not even attacking and they still do some crazy damage. This is with an unleveled artifact too, which as you may remember we have another dot tied to Harpoon. Anyways, here are some AoE fights. For talents I have Improved Traps, Expert Trapper, Serpent Sting, and of course Dragon's Fire Grenade. Basically anything to help me out with AoE. Like I said, Dragon's Fire Grenade is a must-have for AoE because it's more powerful the more enemies you have up, and as you can see here, it just burns through them. Like I mentioned though, I'm not sure if this is intended or not. I think even if they nerf it, our damage is still pretty solid because we still have Explosive Trap, Carve Spam, and the AoE Serpent Sting that goes along with that. In fact, here's a fight without Dragon's Fire Grenade, and as you can see, the damage is still pretty good. I would throw in Tar Trap for some kiting action, but I really don't bother with it because the area of effect is so low. I'm thinking they're going to increase that before release because it doesn't seem very useful as it stands right now. And finally, here's a longer single target fight. For talents, this time I have Animal Instincts for the improved Flanking Strike, Steel Trap for the extra dot, Serpent Sting, and Snake Hunter for the 3 instant Mongoose Bite charges. So far our single target damage is great. Once you have everything dotted up and you start with the Mongoose Bite spam, their health bar just drains. Even at only 10%, the proc rate on those charges is really good. You can easily get to 6 stacks of Mongoose Fury even without Snake Hunter. And of course, once you hit 6 stacks, that's when you want to use Fury of the Eagle to maximize its damage. And that's pretty much it. Hopefully you have a better understanding and feel of how their core gameplay works. The only downside so far is, like I said, I think we have some troubles defense-wise. I guess you could say kiting is sort of a defense, but as it stands right now, I think we're going to have big trouble in PvP if we're getting trained, because we really don't have those tools that other classes have to get out of sticky situations quickly. And with the spec being named survivability, I think being tough to kill should be one of our focuses. Getting disengaged back would definitely be helpful in this regard, I think. But it's hard to say. I've been trying to avoid talking about PvP too much because I just haven't tried it yet. Things can look certain ways, but you'll never really know until you've tried them out, so it's basically just spitballing. As far as the rotation goes, I don't want to speak too much about that because I haven't practiced it enough. Like I said, personally, I'm having some trouble here and there knowing what skills to use because it seems like everything is off cooldown all the time. But that could just be due to my talent choice and lack of experience with the specs, so I'll let you guys be the judge of that. But those small criticisms aside, I really had fun with this spec. It'll be interesting to see how it evolves before Legion releases. I think it's solid as long as they fix the obvious bugs and they take a look at some of those issues I mentioned. Once again though, that's speaking as a casual hunter. My main class on live servers is a Death Knight, so take that as you will. Anyways, if you want to see more survival gameplay, I also did a full dungeon run. No commentary on that though, just some raw gameplay for those of you who want to see more of what this spec is capable of. I'll have an annotation for that right here and a link in the description if you want to see that. And as always, feel free to leave me a message about your opinion on the state of survival spec for Legion, especially all of you veteran hunters out there. Obviously the spec has had quite the dramatic change, and I'd like to hear a pro's perspective if you think it's for the better or for worse. Whether or not you like the changes, I hope you at least found this video informative, interesting, or entertaining in some way. I had a lot of fun making it, and I hope you had a lot of fun watching it. Thanks for checking it out. I'll be doing guides like this for every spec, for every class in the game, so keep an eye out for those if you're interested. And if you have any feedback or suggestions, feel free to leave me a message. There's always room for improvement. Once again, I'll have a poll up in the description if you want to vote on the next class. As an update from the last poll, the Havoc Demon Hunter was supposed to be next, but it turns out you have to level up to 110 to get their talents. So as soon as I do that, I'll be making the Demon Hunter video, but in the meantime we'll be going with whatever wins in the poll, so just a heads up to avoid some confusion down the road. Anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. Give it a like if you liked it, and if you really liked it, let me know in the comments and subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching, good luck, and peace!